Hi, my name's Ali and you're listening to Saltgrass. Season 4 is wrapped up and Season 5 is on its way. And in the meantime, between seasons, I have a few things to share that are not the usual Saltgrass fare. This week and next week, I have a 2-part episode for you. Myself and some fellow podcasters got together last year in a panel discussion at the International NonfictioNow conference. The chat is almost 2 hours long, so I've broken it up into 2 episodes. The first half will air today, right now, and the other half will air next week. The conference is over, but it was an amazing space full of people passionate about journalism and non-fiction, writing, filmmaking and podcasting. In the first half of our chat, which you'll hear today, we take some time to introduce ourselves and the shows we produce. It was a wonderful experience to be part of this thing and to get to know some like-minded podcasters from around Australia. To introduce ourselves and explain what we do, we decided to interview each other, which turned out to be a little bit of a dangerous decision because we all produce interview shows and we like to delve deep in conversations, and we were all really curious about each other. So we could have talked pretty much forever, and I really think we did well to keep it as short as we have. So this first episode is a lovely little glimpse into the hearts and minds and motivations of some climate podcasters in Australia and New Zealand, including myself. And next week we jump into the discussion part of the session.
Hello and welcome. The mission of NonfictioNow, as expressed by the University of Arizona during their 2018 hosting of the event, is NonfictioNow is unique in being neither a conventional academic conference nor a writers' festival, but rather a conversation among peers, from well-established writers and artists to those just starting out. And this panel is just that, a range of practitioners, from the professional to the passionate hobbyist, in a medium that, while not brand new, is the result of technology younger than all of our panelists, and which is not yet quite solidified. From the true crime wave to the spree of corporate acquisitions, podcasting has shown that it's not going anywhere as a medium, that its blend of radio production inputs, all but free distribution, and on-demand availability is a good fit for our day and age. This panel includes the makers of climate-engaged podcasts, using the medium of podcasting to tackle the world's foundational crisis, climate change. You'll first hear from each of these creators in turn about their work and process, as we took turns hosting each other, using those interviewing skills we've developed from our podcasting. And then a roundtable, our own mini-hui, where we engage on a set of questions and with each other's answers to them. Thank you for joining us for this chat about using podcasting for climate engagement. Let's begin.
Hey, I'm Jess.
I'm Ash.
And we're 2 mates on a mission to do something about this climate crisis.
90% of people in Australia want stronger action on climate. Get going, 90%. That's a lot. Like, go.
So we knocked on Greenpeace's door.
What a horn.
We found out what we should do.
But this is one way that you can directly change the system.
And we did it. Together.
That we can get the pens and pencils out.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, is this
And now Ash and I feel heaps better.
Solar panels save the world.
So please subscribe to Heaps Better wherever you get your podcasts. And come with us on a journey from climate anxiety to climate action.
I'm flying to save the planet.
Because trying to save the planet is heaps better together.
3, 2, 1. And we're on. Well, thank you, Jess and Ash. We're here to chat about you guys and about Heaps Better, the podcast that you both brilliantly put together. So without further ado, I think we just launch into the first question. I'm curious, how did Heaps Better come about? And how did Greenpeace get involved?
Well, Jess and I first started talking about making a podcast after I had posted during the bushfires in maybe a lot of distress about how little action was been taken by the government and what could we do, and trying to talk about this idea of maybe making a spreadsheet featuring all of the things that you could do and how long they take and how much they might cost you if there is any cost, and like trying to make it as frictionless as for people to do those actions as possible. So it initially started with this idea of a spreadsheet, but then Jess and I met up and realized that our powers are not in spreadsheet making. Our powers are in podcasting. And so then we started talking with Audiocraft, and Jess is more entrenched in the Audiocraft front. I've been working with them in a freelance capacity for a while, but she's a producer with them. So I'll let you take away the way we got involved with Greenpeace.
So Audiocraft's a production company, podcast production company that I work with, and they'd already been speaking with Greenpeace about working out some way of doing a podcast about climate action, and I think it all just timed really perfectly. But what Ash and I were feeling was that really wild anxiety of January 2020 in Australia. We're in Sydney, and it was blanketed with bushfire smoke, and we just had that. It was that feeling of like, this is really desperate, and there seems to be a lot of inaction. And what can people like us do? What do we do with our time? What do we do with our money? And you have a Google of it, and you get so much advice. So I think it was trying to combat this feeling of maybe futility and just a real desperate need to put this anxiety or this will to do something into action, but find out the most practical ways that we could do it, just as people.
Yeah, and a lot of our friends are in the same boat. Everyone was wanting to do something but overwhelmed and didn't really have any kind of roadmap. And so we approached people who did have a roadmap and did have a strategy.
So Greenpeace were incredible like that. I think they liked the idea of normal people, everyday people who weren't in the climate movement and the climate engagement movement, climate policy, climate business, whatever it was. We're in the creative industries. We met at a community radio station, Ash and I, years ago. They like the idea of that message of being like, okay, what can everyday people, like, how can we get involved and how can we break down some of this maybe jargon or confusing science, stats, policy. And then they were incredible because they just opened the door to us and let us into their research and matched us up with a whole lot of experts in their team and helped us really understand. I mean, like Ash said, the Keep Cup thing before, one of the first things was they were like, no guys, you're gonna be thinking of collective action and systemic change. And we were like, I remember we talked so much about the idea of the Keep Cup being so much guilt going into this like little thing, like, the coffee cups. And that so much of our so much pressure's put on like us as consumers and individuals to be doing the right thing rather than these businesses or, these systems that are not set up right. And so there's all this guilt that goes into something as simple as recycling or a plastic bag or a Keep Cup. And so they were really fantastic in actually helping us to understand how they as an organisation work and how this kind of bigger systemic change and collective action stuff works.
And it also made it a much more positive experience to not be able to, go through each episode with a focus on almost like blaming people and changing people's actions in the day-to-day in a way that was kind of like a big ask for people to, have really significant behavioural change that doesn't seem very sexy or exciting. Whereas what we actually got to with the podcast through working with them through their strategy and through all the research is actions that have a bit more of a massive impact. And a lot of them are things that you can just do once and then you'll create a real significant ongoing impact that is going to last forever and is in a lot of cases irreversible. So
yeah, it's the interesting thing about the Keep Cup I don't know if you guys are feeling the same way, but I hear the Keep Cup conversation come up a lot. But I'm like, the Keep Cup is still good to use. It's a symbol. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So that spreadsheet that you guys made, did many of the kind of things that you had plotted down, that was kind of became the framework for Heaps Better, or did that kind of get thrown out the window and Greenpeace gave you a whole new lease on what you were going to do with the pod?
Some of the things were on there because I think that we're all getting a bit more of a sense that changing our finances and stuff like that can have an impact because that's being pushed by a lot of different people. But a lot of things just fell down the to-do list because they had more of a focus on kind of consumer behavioural change. And at the end of the day, working with Greenpeace on this podcast and knowing what we know through their research and through their extremely knowledgeable and multifaceted team. It just made it clear that it was never going to be a worthwhile podcast for anyone to listen to if it wasn't going to focus on systemic change and how to get involved in that, because that's something that we can see doesn't really exist. Maybe we're blind to it in Australia, and it does exist elsewhere out there, but we knew that we were going to have a short run for our first season, and we wanted to sort of fill it up with as much actionable and kind of like, you know, the first things you should do that have the biggest impact. And now we're going to tell you what that impact would be. And this is how that impact can grow. And this is how you are powerful, so that people could, rather than being like, oh, I feel bad, I want to change what I'm doing, how can I do better? They can just be like, whoa, that's such bang for your buck. That's such win for your minute. If I do that and it takes me 5 to 10 minutes, or if I do that in a you know, takes me maybe like a breakfast with a friend to accomplish that, then I've made so much progress so quickly. And we wanted it also to be fun and to be something that you could do socially, because that, I think, gives the whole kind of set of actions ability to grow and be shared and to be demystified. And that was, I mean, it goes back to the original idea of making a spreadsheet, is just kind of removing friction and confusion and overwhelm from the process of getting things done. And so the whole first series follows things in a certain order that allows you to really kind of take orderly steps towards, basically by the end of the first series, if you've done the things that you were able to do, you should be feeling very freaking proud of yourself, you know, and feeling very good about your impact, because the impact is clear and tangible, and we know that it makes a difference. And we have experts like Simon Holmes-A-Court and, you know, financial experts and people from market forces and, you know, all these great people who are able to quantify that impact. So it becomes a lot more exciting, because you don't feel like you're just kind of like, you know, dropping a drip in the ocean and being like, I'm doing my bit, you know. You actually feel like you're really, and then you feel excited to talk about it, because it's cool to know these things, you know. You see how the world works.
Ash, one of the biggest things you said just then was the breakfast with a friend, which for us was part of maybe the thing that stayed with us from the spreadsheet, was that we wanted to have a way of understanding all this stuff. We basically were like, someone just needs to make this really simple and give us a straight, simple answer so that we can share it with all our friends and do it with all our friends. And we kind of hatched this idea over a series of coffee or some cocktails pre-lockdown, you know, our last espresso quarantini, I think it was. But it was this sense of, when we do these things with people like us and with our friends, it is so much more achievable, because you can egg each other on and you can help break things down, and like you can split up the work of, you know, you research this, you bring this idea to the table, and we'll come together and do it together. And it's even those kind of collective stories, that whether it's just a bunch of mates at a pub or at a cafe or at somebody's house for breakfast, or the parents from the school group, like the Albert Park Kinder Sustainable School Network. When people come together and have that group that community to help give you some momentum, then you can actually get some really serious stuff done, even if it's just making a podcast, you know.
Ash, you spoke about the most beneficial part for you was actually you were worried that it was going to be quite stressful going into it. But you found that digging into it and digging into the science and speaking to all these amazing people actually was most uplifting. That was like the most kind of rejuvenating part of it. I'm curious, just to round off, what has been the best nugget of wisdom that you've both learnt through making the pod?
Totally. And I feel like maybe for me it was the interview we did with Annie Leonard, who's the CEO of Greenpeace USA. And she's phenomenal. Oh my gosh, just such a hero. But the way that she talked about the fact that our politicians work for us made it really land for me for the first time, because I think that we can sort of like maybe trust their authority and feel like, you know, they're maybe working for us, but they're kind of working for the fossil fuel companies in Australia. And the way that she framed it made me feel like we really do have a right to ask for a lot more. And if it's going to be maybe somehow radical the way that we do that, it's valid. It's our planet, you know? So that stuck out to me.
I think it's when Simon Holmes Accord showed us this graph that he'd made of shutting down, the impact of shutting down one coal station being as powerful as shutting down our entire domestic aviation industry in terms of emissions reductions. And the way that he put that in a visual way and was like, we can do this. You know, there's already one that's shut down just the other day from a bunch of community action. So, you know, it was something like that I think made it seem how, rather than trying to change an entire industry, just ending this one is is the most efficient.
Nice to hear how it started and how you guys got your fingers dirty and you created an amazing pod that I've listened to and I've loved. You did such a great job, and bringing in the comedy and obviously your friendship was so fun to listen to. I feel like I know you both really well just from listening to the pod and going on that journey with you and like you said, playing the fool. It makes it so much more accessible to everyone. So I think, you guys really nailed it. And I hope you make another pod together, another season 2 or something.
We're talking about it, but we'll see if Greenpeace has capacity over the next however so long. They're doing many things. There's many campaigns. So a podcast feels like a bit of a luxury, even if it is a climate podcast. Thanks so much for chatting with us. It was so great.
Hello and welcome to The Nature Between Us, a podcast for all your eco-inquiries and musings. My name is Tessa and I'll be your host. I'm an Aussie actress, a voiceover artist, and an environmental master's student. First of all, thanks for tuning in. It's super cool to have you joining me.
Tessa, that jazzy intro to your show that you love, you're on tape as loving it and you never want to change it. Why is that there, and what do you love about it?
I have to be honest. When I first made my podcast, I was like, what? Everyone has a cool intro song. And I went to a website that gave free music, and I was like, I like something that's going to be kind of like wake you up. And it was like one of the first songs that I found on this website that gave out free royalty-free music. And it just said Big Jazz, or it had some really funny name. And I was like, that looks like it could be a good song. And I just picked it, and then I fell in love with it. And you're right, I'm very unapologetic about it. Every episode in season 1 of the pod, I love it even more, and I joke about how I'm just going to slowly put more and more of it in, and there'll be no podcast. There'll just be the jazzy intro song.
A woman named Gretchen Miller, who's actually finishing off a PhD to become a doctor in podcasting about environmental storytelling, it's cool that we're at that point. In her thesis, which is I'm looking forward to reading, it's going to be out soon, she talks a lot about how using natural sounds and the sounds of the natural world in podcasts is one place to put them, but just exposing people to sounds from the natural world kind of makes us connect to it more and have more of a relationship and a care for the natural world. And I'm kind of curious about if you agree with that sort of thesis, and if you would you add more natural sounds into the podcast with the goal of it being sort of reconnecting people with the natural world?
First of all, I 100% agree with that thesis. One of my favorite podcasts is Off Track with Anne Jones, I think, and it's amazing. And they're like half-hour episodes, and there's a lot of nature sounds, a lot of birds, a lot of whales, a lot of everything. So many beautiful, amazing sounds, and it really immerses you straight away in the world of what the episode's about. And I think the first couple of episodes I ever listened to of that podcast was about lyrebirds. And so, of course, the lyrebird has such an incredible call, and it's so fluid and changes and mimics and everything. So, first of all, yes, I would 100%, having fallen in love with Off Tracks, I would love to include more noises and nature sounds and everything. It would just be a matter of me getting better at editing, and hopefully Laura can help me with that. Or, people maybe can send in some like amazing recordings, or I could go out in the field and capture them myself. But yeah, I think it's a really beautiful and easy way to immerse yourself in nature and remind yourself, because especially a lot of us live in urban spaces where we don't often hear the sounds of nature beyond a crow or a magpie. It's really something that I agree with Gretchen, that can immerse and connect people with nature. So, yeah.
So you're an environmental master's student. That's one of the hats you wear, but of course you're also in film and television, you're in the entertainment industry, and I'm curious, from the environmental student side, how many of the people you had on in your first season, maybe how many people you're going to have on in your future seasons, is how many of those people you met or learned of through your course?
Mostly, I would say no one really I met through my course, but definitely what I was learning through my course sparked curiosity that I wanted to focus on in future. So then I would kind of like, I did a subject on urban planning, and then I was like, oh, this would be great to talk to someone about sustainable cities. And of course, my partner knew Jess and was like, Jess Miller would be great. And I was like, yes, she would be amazing if she ever agreed to it. And of course, I'm so thankful that she did, because it's one of my favorite episodes. So yeah, I can definitely say that my degree and studying and being actively exposed to different topics and different kind of conversations and all of that sparked my curiosity and fed as a lot of inspiration for a number of the topics. But in terms of actually connecting with the guests, that was kind of more independently done with me searching them out, or someone saying, oh, who would be great would be this person. You should try. You know how it goes with finding guests. You just shoot out an email and hopefully they reply. Or
I call it planting seeds.
Planting seeds.
Spread them
yes.
far and wide. And see what happens.
Yes.
Have any of those come from your other work in acting and in the lands of TV and film?
They haven't. No. Most of them kind of come from all over. Yeah. Social media is a great tool. I think quite a few I reached out to on Instagram and just said, hey, I'm making a podcast and I hope, you'd be interested, but I totally understand if you have way better things to do than talk to me about environmental issues. But everyone is so generous and lovely and giving. And yeah, I've been really, really lucky with receiving positive feedback and excitement to be involved. So, yeah.
I'm really glad I asked that question, because it's very interesting to hear that, your method of going about getting guests is the same way that mine was and every other podcaster I know. And it's like, we kind of have this picture that, someone who's on TV can just, have a Rolodex and people will line up.
No, it's the same. You just, you write a long message and you hope that they read it. And
yep.
Yeah.
Did you have, a person in mind, or a type of person in mind for who you thought this podcast was for?
Didn't have a specific person, but I did kind of have an idea of who I was trying to reach. And it's not an age group or, any sort of specific demographic. It is really just that person who wants to know more but doesn't know how to go about that. And I know that so many podcasts are trying to reach that same person, which is great, and that's why they all should exist and we all should listen to them. But I suppose, that person that maybe would not, that maybe would be shy about asking the kind of entry level questions, that wants to just be like, I don't really get climate change, or I don't really understand what fracking is. And then to find an episode of The Nature Between Us that's all about fracking, which I haven't done yet, but would be great. To, just that breaks it down and in a kind of, like an easy to digest way. So I guess, the person that wants to know more and wants to kind of be educated but not be made to feel guilty about their life, because, I do worry that sometimes like that kind of like information dump can be quite off-putting in a way. So
back to basics, break it down, make things very relatable, and it's remarkable the lack of jargon and acronyms and insider talk in your show. It's very like you step into the role for your guests as the friend at the barbecue who's very interested in what you're doing, what you've got to say, but has no idea about what they do. So there's no like, so do you know this term? No. Explain it to me like I know nothing. You hypothetically, someone who's willing to ask the head weather reporter for the ABC morning show what a cloud is. That kind of hypothetical. Real story. What's a moment from making the show that, looking back on it, that's meant a lot to you? That like it's not to put it in these terms. Essentially, you don't have to answer it in these terms. But for me, I'd be like, what's the most value you've gotten out of making the show?
My answer is just going to be like literally everyone that I speak to. I can't pinpoint one moment that's more value than any other. Like every guest I've learnt so much from, and I've had such an enjoyable time speaking to them about the topic that they're specialising in. I really can't. I'm sorry, Mark. I can't even like pick one moment. Everyone, anytime anyone agrees to come on the podcast, I'm like, oh, thank you. And then they speak to me and they have so much to share. Everything's so valuable.
Life in the 2020s is different. There's more masks.
Hey guys, what's up, you? Different options for DIY at-home masks.
Less plane travel. More fires, more smoke, more coastal erosion.
Of course, the sand does come and go, but again, I've never seen it like this before, not in my lifetime.
Not enough water in some places and too much in others.
A woman's been rescued from a tree and a train derailed as parts of the state continue to be battered by wild
What's
weather.
a person to do in a world with an already changed climate? Did I say already changed? Yeah, and on track for much more change.
Shifting baseline syndrome, a phenomenon of lowered expectations in which each generation regards a progressively poorer natural world as normal.
In fact, the only thing we know for certain about the future is that our already weird present is just the beginning. We are through the looking glass. The shows in the Climactic Collective are your guide, created by fellow travelers, but without feeling the need to constantly explain the greenhouse effect.
Greenhouse gases are a bit like a doona.
So check out climactic.fm and our flagship podcast, Climactic, to get involved and engaged with the climate crisis. Because these are climactic times, and everything has changed.
I kind of want to get to your origin story first, because I know that you have been a long-term podcast consumer in a big way. And I'm just wondering how that ties in with your transition into actually creating, and what was your first project when you started creating podcasts?
Yeah, that is the story. Just, podcast nerd, like an absolute fanboy. You just never saw me as a kid without headphones on. Like, that was my go-to thing. Like my parents and family members would joke of they'd see my ears and they're like, oh good, proof they exist, because we had no idea what was under there.
Because you look like you do now with headphones on.
Exactly. This is Mark in his native environment. So for me, having sort of grown up with this stuff, there was, it's like the classic story of the kid who's really into film, and then they find out that, oh wow, they can go to film school and they can study this stuff and they too can learn how to make it. But for me, I didn't go that path of going into audio engineering. I wasn't in one place very long as a kid growing up, so I didn't have the standard route of get involved in a local community radio station or a college radio station. It was only in my very late teens that a friend had a slot on a student radio here in Auckland, New Zealand, and I was going along and jumping on the graveyard radio shift and learning how to speak into a mic and thinking, oh, this is fun. I'll maybe do more of this one day. But it wasn't until my wife and I, now wife, we moved over to China, and we were teaching English over there for a couple years. And it was over there, I'm exposed to so many just cool stories and just so much sort of like life is happening here in such a different way than I've ever experienced before. And my wife started vlogging about it, and I was like, I should really start a podcast. So I started looking into it, and then I realized how hard it is to distribute a podcast from China because of the Great Firewall, and there's actually constraints. It's actually really difficult. So I decided not to, and I instead picked it up when we moved to the UK in 2016, and it was all, Brexit was all in the works, and everyone was in a furor about the EU, and I'm just I'm here as an American Kiwi kid, and I don't know anything about the EU or the UK or this common market or the history of all this stuff. So I was I'll do a series about this as an excuse to talk to people. I was straight away I'm not going to make a podcast for anyone but myself, and the making of the podcast is just an excuse to find out more about a thing I'm interested in. Yeah. And it was called Me and You, EU. And it was interesting. It'll never see the light of day. It's now deleted. It's not anywhere on the internet. So I had an experience of making 6 or 7 episodes of this thing and then being okay, I learned a lot, delete.
Okay, that's interesting.
You can do that. I love that you can, and it's not still hanging around. I shouldn't say that so assertively in case someone does manage to drag it out of a hard drive or something.
Yeah. But that's interesting because it sounds like you started right from the start looking at social, political issues. And of course, in the thick of Brexit and all of that stuff, that was an obvious choice. But you obviously have an interest in those topics as well.
It was what was going on in those headphones I was wearing all the time. Just 7 or 8 hours a day of politics and sort of geopolitical stuff. Being 2016, that year especially was my high watermark for podcast consumption. It was, honestly, I could name every politics show from New York Times. I forget the Chicago Sun-Times had a really good podcast as well. 538, the data analytics guys. Washington Post, of course. All the UK newspapers are putting out politics podcasts at this time because there was so much to talk about. So I was trying to listen across the spectrum in a way that I found that I can listen to people I disagree with quite easily. I can even find sometimes them to be persuasive and at least explaining their perspective, but I can't read it. I can't read, a politics rag.
That's interesting.
Without getting upset. But yeah, if someone's telling me why they feel something, I'm okay.
It's more like you're down at the pub and they're just telling you their opinion, and it feels more like an opinion than someone writing it down permanently for all time on the written page is
Precisely. The need to kind of be unequivocal or have such a strong assertive statement in writing. Whereas if you're speaking to somebody, you can be well, I'm not sure exactly this is how I feel, but here's a hypothetical.
Yeah.
Whereas that's so hard to write.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And so when did you start focusing on the climate, and when did it crystallize for you as the topic that you really wanted to hone in on?
Yeah, it was later than that, and talking to sort of climate folks a lot since then, I realized I came into this very, very much later in my life. Climate anxiety and worries, and it was looked down on in my kind of family setting, it was the lefties and the greenies, and so I thought pressing issues were potential conflicts between nation states and food security and politics, the very much the Kissinger kind of school of what's are the important flaws with the world, what's important. So it was arriving in Melbourne and getting a job at a hospitality, a software company that was selling point of sale software for hospo, and I was like going along to this. I was presenting for the company at a trade show, and I got talking to a sustainability consultant, and they just framed it so well for me within this like 10-minute conversation of like, did you know that the hospitality industry puts out this much food waste, which is equivalent to this many cars on the road worth of methane? And I was just like, oh, this isn't something that's happening over there. This is actively part of the industry I'm in. And I'd been so relieved to arrive in the UK, much less Melbourne, after 2 years living in China, where I was like witnessing a post-apocalypse environmental situation where you've got stagnant rivers and dead fish, and like I understand what an oceanic dead zone is. I've seen one very small in a lake that was in the city I lived in. And you'd go for a swim. If you're brave, you'd smell very bad for a couple days after, and you just like swim past dead turtles. They're just bobbing in this lake, and you're just like. So after leaving that scene, I was like, oh, it's so much better that the environment's just good here and everything's fine. So then I went down the rabbit hole, and I just started talking to people who knew a lot more than me and had been involved for a lot longer than me. And then by just saying, I'm here to learn, a lot of doors opened. To the extent that I was invited, I was told, hey, you should apply to go to Climate Reality in 2019, which is the Al Gore group. So I did, and went to Brisbane. For little did we know at the time, it was the last big Climate Reality event in person before all this happened. It was 800 people in a room, just getting to meet Mike Cannon-Brookes and Simon Holmes a Court, and all just the mayor of the Torres Strait Islands, and just like, oh, okay. This whole movement and this whole space, it's just people, and I've now met these people and pressed the flesh, and it's like, okay, this isn't inscrutable. This is very, very knowable and human and welcoming if you get a good on-ramp into it.
Yeah, very interesting. And so how did that lead to what's now the Climactic Network? And why did you think, for a start, what is a podcast network? Because a lot of people watching this might not know. And why did you want to make one? What did you think it would help achieve?
So after I'd started Climactic, which is one podcast feed where myself and a co-host were just interviewing everyday people about how they felt about climate change and what they were doing about it, not trying to talk to the leaders, not trying to talk to the big names in the space, just everyday folks. I came across a lot of other people who wanted to create content as well and had a specific point of view and a cool intersection with things. So we had a psychologist who was active with Psychology for a Safe Climate, which is a group of working psychologists and psychotherapists who are specifically looking at how they can work on climate grief and climate topics. And I was like, well, you should have a podcast. And I've been thinking a lot about that, but I don't know where I'd start. And I said, well, I've got this feed. Why don't you just, first of all, let me help you make a few episodes, see if it's for you, and then you can put it out here on this feed. And then it became, well, why don't we have more than one show, which has, already was a grab bag of me and my co-host doing episodes about what we were interested in. And that became 3, 4, 5 hosts very quickly as Climactic took on more things, and then I got a job at a big enterprise podcast host, basically like a book publisher, where all of a sudden me being a publisher of more than one show and running a network, which I'll explain in just a second, was a good thing for me professionally in my job, and they basically they gave us, not to quote Fight Club to a great audience of nonfiction storytellers, but we had corporate backing. We got, in-kind support. So a podcast network in a nutshell is, so you've got one podcast and there's a lot of jobs that go into running that show, much less scaling it up. And a podcast network is just simply economies of scale for the jobs that can be done by one person across multiple shows, rather than each show having to have a different person do that role. What those roles are, what the shows need, depend on the shows. So if the show is selling advertising, there can be one person at the network who sells advertising space on those shows across the network. What it means in terms of Climactic is simply I kind of coordinate things in herd cats. I help shows promote on each other's shows. I help them come up with a good workflow for how to publish, how to check their analytics and understand what's working and what's not, and basically just centralize a lot of the tools and resources that people need to start a show.
So is it just you mostly doing all that stuff, or do you have other people with different roles within the Climactic Network now?
It's the team is contracted and grown. The team has grown and contracted over time. Currently, there's a couple other people who've helped me out with like guest publishing the Climactic show, which is basically a curation of what's going on within the network. What that means is every week we have a new episode out, but selecting what that episode's going to be from the shows on the network, introducing it, getting approval, finding out how to, like when to feature something at the right time for something that might be going on, relevant in the news. A couple members of the team have helped me out with that guest producing role recently, which is my first time actually stepping back from being the one to publish a show every week since April 2018. So I realized that was going on 3.5 years since I'd last had a break from publishing a weekly show, which is crazy.
That's pretty hectic. That's a lot. Yeah.
It became so normal. It just became an hour of my Saturday of okay, it's time to find an episode and record an intro. And I got good at doing it fast, but it's delightful to wake up and actually what's going to be out today? I don't know. It's going to be a surprise. It was really good. We've had someone writing a newsletter, which has been really good. They've just recently had to step back, so it's feeling like 2022 is going to be a new phase for Climactic, where you have to kind of rebuild and also come at it with maybe some fresh intentionality, because 3 years ago there wasn't a lot of climate podcasts. Now there is. So what are we doing other than just being a collection of climate podcasts? Because that's no longer unique or potentially valuable. Is it that these are particularly good climate podcasts? I'm not sure. Should that be it?
And also, you started the network while you were living in Australia, and now you've moved back to New Zealand. And I know that for a while there, it was largely focused on Australian climate podcasts. And I imagine that would also be changing now that you're back in New Zealand and you're networking with different people and,
Not a lot of networking locally happening in the last couple months because of lockdown, but it definitely was before. We were starting to build momentum. We definitely will be after. But honestly, my big, hairy, audacious goal for this is to have shows in Australia, in New Zealand, in Fiji, in Tonga, and Samoa, and
so the Pacific region.
Absolutely. So that's my name.
Pan-Pacific.
Pan-Pacific is the goal and the scope of what I'd love to achieve.
So, this is very exciting because I've been listening to your podcast a lot. I guess it's time to introduce you, Alison Hanley, or Ali as we're going to call you in this chat, and your podcast is called Saltgrass. And can you tell us a bit about what saltgrass means and where that kind of original kernel of the idea came for you with the podcast?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It was something I sort of sat on for a couple of years before I made it happen. And I was tossing around names and all sorts of things. And I don't know, I the very first series I did, which was kind of like the pilot project, was back in 2018. And I got some local council funding and I made 8 episodes just to kind of test the idea, see if there was enough stories locally to talk about. Turns out there's more than enough stories. And also to test myself. So I've come from a community radio background, and my local station was able to auspice that grant, and I made the 8 episodes for Main FM. And yeah, it sort of was, back then I called it an environment for change, because I was trying to play with words and see how to get environment and climate change and all that stuff in the title. And then by the time I got around to actually getting a second round of funding from the Community Broadcasting Foundation, and they funded the bigger project that it's become, I think I realised that there were heaps and heaps and heaps of things out there playing with that kind of wording. And so I wanted something completely different, something a bit about the natural world, really. And so saltgrass is an actual plant that we have in Australia. It's quite rare, but it's out there. And it's a plant that can survive in really saline soils and can be an important species to stabilise soils when there's a lot of degradation and erosion and things like that. And so for me, on lots of levels, the name then started to really work as what are people doing at a grassroots level about climate change, and how can, salt of the earth people in regional and rural Australia, because a lot of the climate movement is city-based, and then there becomes this city-country divide. And I feel like there's heaps happening, and there's heaps of people who care about the risks of climate change in the regions, but it's not that well known or that well.
That's really interesting. So it's kind of like, it's almost like, sounds as if you were making it for the movement, to make sure that the movement, because it's so exciting and there's so many parts to it, are reflected. But I mean, that's also a question. Who was your top of mind kind of audience member, or were there multiple that you thought would be really hungry for something like this?
So I started out really just thinking about my local radio station and its reach. I knew I wanted to make it a podcast, but I didn't know how far that would go. But I wanted it to be available for people to listen to after, because your 1 hour slot on a radio station, once that goes to air, it's over. No one can listen to it anymore. So I really like the idea of people being able to find it later and listen when they were ready to, which is the beauty of podcasting. But I think I knew that we had quite a rich local community around climate action. And so I knew there were quite a few stories locally. But after I'd made that first series, I started working for the local sustainability group to really get in the mix and find out what was happening and be part of what was happening. And then I really saw how much was going on and how many people were working on so many different levels to make change happen. Yeah.
Totally. I remember that I was listening to an episode of yours today, and someone mentioned wicking beds, and I was like, cool, I know what wicking beds are, but then I realized I only knew that about 10 months ago max. And so you actually clarified that, and I think that that's so helpful, because people aren't taking out their dictionary the whole time they're listening to a podcast. So yeah, it was really, really accessible, and I feel like you might have even helped your guests to speak in a more accessible way, because a lot of them have kind of scientific chops and kind of, policy and chops and stuff like that, but you've managed to make it really accessible. Is that something that you needed to work on?
I think ultimately I wasn't making it for people who are already convinced or who are heavily involved in climate action, because I think they already know all the stuff. Like, the knowledge around climate has been around for a long time, but it's reaching the people who are not resistant or climate deniers, because I think that's a whole nother demographic that's really hard to reach. But the people who are just living their daily lives but maybe feel like it's not to do with them, or it's someone else will solve it, or it's a bigger problem than what they can handle. So they just get on with life. But actually they're the sort of people who really care and would care if they knew more about it. So I sometimes I work, another job, as we all do, and I often think about my workmates, and we just chat as we work, and so I often hear their attitudes and their feelings about things, and I think about them when I'm making an episode to try and explain it to people who don't know all the stuff. So sometimes you've really got to give the context, because people who know it, often there's a little bit of jargon and there's a little bit of, shorthand.
Yeah, exactly. How do you, especially when you have guests who might be quite qualified to talk on a certain subject and may bring with them a lot of jargon, because that's the world they live in. And we're talking about concepts that can be quite complex. Like, for example, the most recent one of yours I've listened to is kind of about soil and like the soil carbon sponge. There's so many things that go into that are quite scientific. It's quite hard to pass, and it's quite hard to make accessible for an audience who've just glimpsed it and only through their ears. So how do you kind of make sure that it's accessible and make sure that it's something that if someone in your community was to get it, they wouldn't feel excluded? Yeah,
I think that's actually really important to me. I've always been the kind of person who doesn't like to be exclusive or elitist or use language that isn't, I don't know, it's always just bugged me when people do that. But I think with Jess, I was very lucky. Jess is the soil expert you were talking about, and she is a science communicator. So I think part of her job is to explain things well. But I think I do always just go back to thinking, as someone's talking, I might just cut in and say, oh, so what's that about? just trying to always remember who could be listening, who might not understand. And if you talk about too much stuff that, like, one or two things could get by and people will keep listening. But if you're constantly talking that way, anyone who doesn't understand it all will just switch off because it's meaningless to them. So I think in order to keep an audience and to make it as accessible as possible, and ultimately we're trying to talk to people about one of the most important issues of our time. And so we need to keep them with us. Yeah, we need to keep people with us. So, yeah, that's kind of, I'm kind of always trying to think of that in the background.
Well, for people who are looking for a podcast episode of yours to listen to, do you have any favourites, and do you have any sort of things that you feel like encapsulate what you like about your podcast?
One episode, or two episodes actually, that really stand out for me. And I had no idea it would become this when I started the process of these two interviews. But it's with John Reed, who's a sourdough baker. And I'd known him for a long time in my community, and I'd worked for him in the past. And he had a very serious diagnosis, and he's subsequently passed away, actually. But I approached him saying, oh my God, now's the time to talk to you, because clearly his health was at a very significant point. And so we had an interview, just talked about his life as a baker, but he's also been really instrumental in leading or being part of a movement called Grains. So I did one episode about him and his bakery and what he's been doing, and then another episode with a bunch of people from Grains who I wouldn't have had access to or thought to interview without him. And I think that those two episodes together really, because a lot of people talk about how to live more sustainably, how to not subscribe to the economy as it is, but develop alternative economies and things like that. But a lot of it's really theoretical, but he's been living it, and those guys are all living it. And for me, it made it really real, and it made me really believe that it's actually possible. So on a personal level, as much as I talk about this stuff all the time, a lot of it's theoretical, and a lot of it's like, oh, what we need to do and what we should all be doing. But these people have been living it, and It really gave me hope.
Awesome.
Yeah. That was the first half of a two-part series of audio taken from the NonfictioNow conference, in which I was a panellist on one of the sessions. Stay tuned for the second half of this panel discussion next week, when we wrestle with some of the issues facing journalism today in a world where anyone can make media and often there are no editors. In the face of the climate crisis, what can we do as media makers to cut through the noise and communicate real information to real people? So stay tuned for that next week. Thanks for listening. My name is Ali, and this is Saltgrass.